we are back with another episode of Around the Ballpark podcast. My name is Mike Redman. I am your host alongside my co-pilot and brother, Darren Redman, and we are very excited. Today is going to be very interesting. We have somebody on our podcast with us. His name is Doug, and Doug was a former bullpen catcher for both the Cleveland Indians and the Colorado Rockies. So at this time, I'd like to, without further ado, introduce Doug Rupple. I appreciate you coming on.
No problem. No problem. Yeah, it's actually Rupple, but that's fine.
Rupple. Okay. Rupple. Got it.
Excellent.
That's okay. When I got signed by the Mets, they on the TV thing they pronounced it Rauple. They threw an A in there, so they added a couple extra letters to my name. So that was another indication that wasn't going to last. But anyway,
gotcha. If you want to go ahead and just tell us a little bit about yourself, and what you had done and what you're doing now, that sort of thing, and then we'll kind of get into it right after that.
All right. Well, originally I'm from Canton, Ohio. Grew up about 6 blocks from the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and played football and baseball and all that. And actually got signed right out of high school by the Indians to play at the time in the New York Penn League, way back in the day in 1981, and
great league,
didn't last too long. What's that?
That's a great league.
Yeah, it was, and it's funny though now how, now that all the years later I've worked in baseball and especially visiting some of the new minor league parks, I just am amazed at how nasty those fields were back in the New York Penn League. Just the ballparks were falling apart, the fields were terrible. And it was amazing more people didn't get hurt, to be honest with you.
Well, let me just stop you there. You're 100% right. It's like I live now in Cape Cod, and we all know about the legendary Cape Cod Summer League, the best of the best. Those fields are not very good. It's amazing. Those fields are not very good at all.
And that's really a shame. You'd think they would invest a little bit more in the playing surfaces now with what's on the line. 100%. For these young kids now, because it's amazing how fast these kids are ready now, as opposed to back in my day.
So go ahead. So now you signed. You're in the
yeah. So I got hurt shortly. I had to end up having double knee surgery. So and that's a kind of a funny thing. Literally, as I was waking up from my anesthesia, I was given a Western Union that I was released.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I'm not kidding you. It was hilarious. I still have it. And so after I finally got healthy a little bit, I got invited to spring training with the Rangers. Then I kind of got put in a little deal with the Cubs and traded to them at the end of spring training. They wanted to send me to the Mexican League, and then I kind of just decided I'd had it. And I moved to Ocean City, Maryland. And I've been a DJ for most of my life, but I never left the baseball thing too far behind. And what happened was I actually went to a Cleveland Indians fantasy camp, and I won the MVP of the camp, and my team won the championship and all. And as I was getting ready to leave, I was going to head down to Key West, and one of the coaches, Jeff Torborg, said to me, who was a former Indian, he said, "Hey, he was, and he's an unbelievable guy too." He said to me, he goes, a friend of mine with the Montreal Expos, they're looking for a bullpen catcher for spring training. Would you want to go over and help them? I told him you'd probably be a great fit for them. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, if you want to go over, they'll take you for a week. They'll take you for a day. However long you want to stay. Well, I ended up going over to West Palm that year and caught with the Expos, which was kind of cool, except for the very first guy out of my car I get to catch was Randy Johnson. And he was throwing about 103 miles an hour and didn't have quite the pinpoint control he had later on in his career. But that team was loaded. I mean, it was Andre Dawson and Larry Walker, and I mean, it was just amazing. That Gary Carter, just a great team they had back then. And so I did that with him. I ended up staying the whole spring training with him, and I was gonna go back and help him the next year. And when I called the Indians to go to their fantasy camp again, they hired me. They said, no, why don't you come down and help us instead? You've won all the awards. So I kind of went down and started helping them. I did a little help with fantasy camp because what happens is campers come down and they plunk down that money and they don't do a lot of stretching and stuff before they get there and they get hurt. And there's not enough campers sometimes to keep those rosters going. So they use guys like us to kind of be roster fillers to keep the games going. So I was basically getting a free fantasy camp. And then from there, I was getting ready to leave then to go over to West Palm. And then they said, no, you're staying with us.
That's great.
And that's how it started with the Indians. And I did that for 12 years with them. I would do fantasy camp, spring training. Then I'd usually go back to Cleveland with them for April and part of May until their high school kids or college kids would get out of school. Then they would get a little extra help and they would pick up a little side bullpen catcher and some extra clubhouse guys to fill in. So I would just help them in the early part of the season, come back to Ocean City, do my summer. And then when September would come, I'd go back to Cleveland and help them because they were in the playoffs and World Series in the 90s all the time. They had such great teams with Albert Bell and Kenny Lofton and
those teams are dynamic.
Marvis. I mean, the whole lineup was unbelievable. 1 through 9 was amazing. And it was fun. And then when the Indians were moving to back over to Arizona, they moved to Goodyear, Arizona. They built a complex with the Cincinnati Reds. So they basically weren't going to need my services anymore. And the funny thing was, then I got a call by the Rockies. And from a guy I worked with for a short time in A-ball in the South Atlantic League with the Delmarva Shorebirds, the Baltimore Orioles single A club. The first year they were a Montreal Expos farm team. So that was kind of also how I had my leg in the door for that as well. And he remembered me and then gave me a call and offered me a couple different. I actually did a lot of jobs with the Rockies. I did everything everything I did for the Rockies was just spring trainings. I only I did 7 spring trainings with them.
Wow.
So that's all I did. I just would go down for spring training. And, but I did everything from bullpens to throwing BP, hitting fungos to infielders, shagging flies. I set up the fields. What I did was I usually got there at 4:30 in the morning every day. And met with all the coaches, found out what they needed on the fields, and set everything up. And then I basically, they just pinballed me around the complex, whoever needed me. And it was so much fun.
That is outstanding. Well, first of all, I mean, Mike, if you don't mind, I just want to make a point. And it shows 3 things from you right off the jump. And I've never spoken to you before, but just knowing these sports teams and hearing your story, you're reliable, you're talented, and the pitchers had to like you. I know for a fact that if they didn't like what you could do and the way that you caught them and this, you don't get those jobs because you're just hanging around.
And that's true, and it's funny you say that because there was instant chemistry with so many pitchers within the first 1 or 2 times I had sessions with them, bullpen sessions. And it was there were some guys I loved catching, and there were other guys I did not enjoy catching at all. And we still got along okay, but they knew they frustrated me. And I'll give you an example. I loved catching Jeff Francis, who was when he was with the Rockies. He reminded me a lot of Charlie Nagy when I caught Charlie Nagy with the Indians. Reminded me a lot of that because he could paint the corners really well. He wasn't a hard thrower, but he could hit the corners, and he was kind of a little lesser Greg Maddux is what I would say. He just, but he for about a 4 or 5 year period, Jeff Francis was very, very reliable through a lot of innings. And did not walk a lot of guys, so he was a good guy, and I love catching him. The guy that I did not enjoy catching a whole lot was Ubaldo Jimenez.
All right.
Matter of fact, he broke that little finger.
Wow. If I may ask, how did that happen?
Normally when you're sitting in the bullpen, you like if you're catching in a game, you'll put your throwing hand behind your your foot or somewhere out of or behind your glove.
Johnny
Well,
Bench.
When you're just squatting in the bullpen, I'd a lot of times set my hand on my shin guard and just had it sitting there. And he threw a big curveball, and it hit that dirt and came up and just literally caught the tip of my finger and snapped it.
Oh, wow.
And I just remember telling him every day at lunch when I'd walk by him, I go, "Hey, Baldo, thanks, man. That's now the perfect angle when I got something in my ear. It's perfect." And he just would look at me, but and then there was another guy that I didn't really like catching because he would kill me. We had a closer for a while named Manny Corpus.
Okay, I'm not familiar.
Oh my God, this was about 2007 to about maybe 2010.
Mm-hmm.
And boy, I'll tell you what, this guy could throw 102, 103, but you just never knew where it was going to go. And there's nothing more fun than catching a ball on this part of your hand.
Right.
And it'll send a shiver up into your neck.
Oh, I'm sure.
And so, it's not a good feeling.
So I need to ask, you're catching, you mentioned Randy Johnson, but yet he did have the pinpoint control, yet you said, but what was that like? Walk me through that.
Well, it was awesome because I knew who he was at that point. He'd already been in the league a year or so, and he had a reputation of being, a hard thrower and everything, but he also, was a little erratic back then. He was nice. I enjoyed catching him because he was one of those guys that kind of worked up to it. So his first couple of throws weren't going to scare the heck out of me. And then he would kind of work into it. And then, as depending on what he was working on that day, if he was working on his curveball or something, that would be a little scary sometimes. But I'd almost rather catch his fastball back then, because at least I knew it was going to be straight for the most part. And if it's straight, I'll catch it. But if it's got a huge bend and it's coming at a crazy rate, sometimes you just don't know.
And, it's got that big break.
Yeah. Well, and that same Expos team had Dennis Martinez on it.
Yeah. Oh my God.
And of course, then I caught him a couple of years later in Cleveland,
right.
And he was awesome. It was Dennis Martinez, Oral Hershiser, Charlie Nagy.
Wow.
That was you
caught some studs. You caught some studs.
Yeah, I did. And it was kind of funny because I caught Rafael Betancourt when he was with the Indians. And then a couple of years later, he was there with us with the Rockies. Mm-hmm. And, but yeah, I enjoyed, like, Aaron Cook wasn't bad. I liked catching him. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of good, Jason Hamill back in the day. These are all the guys that I caught back then. Were really, really nice, super guys. And there wasn't too many of them that were, we weren't on the same page. Right. Most of them were pretty cool, especially in spring training. It's mainly for the pitchers. It's really each day they're working on something different, and so, that's the good part. You're not just getting beat up with fastballs every day. They're like one day they may be out there just working on sliders, or the next day it's changeups, or whatever. So it's or they're just working on location, up and down. And so that's kind of there's so much that goes into it. It's amazing. I mean, I would have never guessed, and especially now, I bet I'd be maybe not lost, because it might even be easier with all the analytics they have now, because they were just starting to get into it when I left, because my last year was 2012. Mm-hmm. And the analytics and all that was really just starting to come into it. And the spreadsheets and all that, where it is funny, because I mean, everything is down to, they have everything, man. I mean, they have everything that you can think of now, for every hitter, every tendency, every weakness. It is scary. It is scary how well everybody knows everybody.
And the different abbreviations, like, I'm good. Like, I know a lot of different things, but I, recently pulled up some stats and I'm like, what is BBR? And what is just these, I just made that up, but like, there's so many I don't even know like where they come from, and they just more and more. And speaking of more and more, like, I don't know, like back when you were in those years, like with the backfields. Like if we're talking about the backfields, I remember back then, like there were 2, maybe 3, sometimes 4. I was at Clover Park today for the Mets spring training opener against the Cardinals, and we went back there in mid innings because the Mets had blew the game in the first inning. It was bad, and so we're walking around in the back, and there's just fields everywhere. It was just like they were growing like Dollar Generals and Wawas. They were just coming from everywhere. I'd never seen so many backfields before, and so you're right. They're probably working on every little field. Some are really small, some are huge, but
It's
working on so
awesome.
much.
And that's the best part about spring training. For if you're a fan, it is great. Go, and I recommend that. Go to those backfields because first of all, that's where you're going to get autographs. That's where you can actually get sometimes some one-on-one with some of the players. But yeah, usually the backfield. Now I'll tell you what. When I was with the Rockies, my first 5 years, we were in Tucson at High Corbett Field, which used to be home for the Cleveland Indians for like 40 some years back in the 40s until they moved over to Winter Haven. And of course, that's where they filmed part of the first Major League movie was down there when Willie Mays Hayes was running. Yeah, that was all there at High Corbett Field.
You may run like Mays, but you hit like
That's right. That's right. And it was kind of cool because there was actually a couple little props still around the ballpark from the movie when my first year with the Rockies because I had one of the grounds guys show me some of the stuff and it was pretty cool. But High Corbett Field back then, it's actually a county-owned park that they would during spring training come put a fence up around it and basically fence it off for the Rockies. During the regular part of the year, it was just a field for teams to come play ball on. Nice. Other than the stadium itself. Now, when we moved to Scottsdale, to the holy grail of all spring training sites, and I do mean that, Salt River Field at Talking Stick is the cathedral of cathedrals for spring training sites. If you have never went there, I suggest it because I'm telling you, it is better than any site that is in existence right now. It is the most laid out thing. Each team that we share it with the D-backs, each team has 9 fields, backfields. Well, you have the stadium that is a replica of I think it's a replica of Coors Field, and then you have, or maybe it's a kind of a general between the two, Coors and Bank One. Then you go on either side. The Rocky side, they have a main field that is an identical replica of Coors Field. Then you go same thing on the other side for the D-backs. Then there are 7 other fields after those. And one of them is pretty cool. It's just this half field where it's just an infield with a little fence around it. It's basically for the infielders to go over and take infield work. Then we would have another section of just home plate areas where you'd beat the catchers up. It wasn't the bullpen area. It was just where they'd literally, throw those, get the machines and shoot balls in the dirt at the catchers to go right and left and block balls. And then they had a bunting station. They had it's an outdoor BP place with a roof over it, so it's open air with cages in there. And then we had what we called a 6-pack bullpen and an 8-pack bullpen, where it was 8 mounds and 6 mounds. And I'm telling you, but the complex, she just kept walking, and every field was gorgeous and tailor-made, and just, oh my God. And one of my favorite things was, because I set the fields up every morning, even at Salt River on the Rocky side, was I was always one of the first ones out on the field in the morning as the sun was coming up. And it would be just me and a few groundskeepers. And, the grass is still wet.
Yeah.
And the sun's just coming up and hitting that wet grass against that beautiful brown dirt. And I'd be the only one out there. And it was just the most peaceful feeling. being surrounded by all this beautiful ballpark
That's gotta
and
be
knowing that,
great.
yeah, we're going to tear it up in a few minutes, but God, it's gorgeous right now.
This is before, yep, absolutely. And and thanks for sharing that. And also too, I know that you had some experience. For those that may not know what fantasy camp is, maybe you can kind of quickly share what fantasy camp is, and maybe if you have a memory that kind of sticks out with that.
One of my favorite memories of all time. This was at the Indians fantasy camp. Um, we're getting ready to go in for lunch. When you're a fantasy camper, I'm not sure what it runs now. It's probably about $5,000 to go down for the week, but you get home and away authentic uniforms with your name on them. Excuse me. You get the jacket, pullovers, hats, home and away. You get everything. They set you up like a big leaguer. You got your name plate above your locker. They at least, I mean, they literally do everything for you. It's amazing. Excuse me. Then you play double headers every day against the other campers. And you play double headers every day, and then at the end of the week, there's normally a championship round. And then what happens is they have a under the lights game in the stadium for the two top teams to play a championship game. And then usually on the final day, every team that's represented or has a camping team gets to play 3 innings against the major leaguers, the former pros. And that's always a fun time. Because one of my favorite things was, I got to hit off Bob Feller. And of course, I got to catch Bob Feller, of course. And even in the 80s, this dude could bring it. I'm telling you, in his 80s, Bob Feller could still throw in the mid to high 70s. And it blew me away. Every single day at spring training, he'd get in uniform and he'd go out to a brick wall and he'd throw against a wall. And a few times I'd walk by and say, Bob, you want me to catch it? He'd say, no, I like being able to bend over and get the ball. And that's a good workout for me. I said, okay. I said, if you ever need me, you know where I'm at. Mm-hmm. And then one of my favorite things happened one day. I'm on my way in from lunch to go to lunch between our double headers. And Mike Paul, a former Cleveland pitcher who is a huge scout. I think he's with the Texas Rangers now. But he's been a scout, major league scout for years after retiring from baseball. But he'd come down and work the camps as a former Indian. He also at that particular time was Dennis Eckersley's pitching coach with the Oakland A's. Wow. And so Eckersley stopped by to see Mike and hadn't thrown yet leading into spring training. And he said, man, do you think I could throw a little bit? And I'm walking into the clubhouse and Mike Paul yells, hey, Rupe, you want to do me a favor? And I said, sure. And he goes, do you really want that ham sandwich or do you want to go catch a Hall of Famer? And I said, what? He said, going up to the stadium, somebody's waiting for you. He didn't tell me who. So I walked up to the stadium. There he was. There was Dennis Eckersley. Wow. And it was one of the greatest things. He was pinpoint. He hadn't thrown all winter. And he only had like 2 weeks before spring training was going to start. And he hadn't thrown it all. And he said, he goes, listen, I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I may not hit your glove. Well, let me tell you something. I could have put a shot glass behind home plate, and he'd have put it in there. It was amazing. His slider was, I wouldn't have even wanted to hit it because it was so devastating. I couldn't believe it. I'd never caught anything like it. But it was so cool. Well, if anybody ever goes to anybody listening wants to see any of these pictures, they're on my Facebook page. And if you go to my Facebook page, it's Doug Rupple at Facebook. But if you go to the pictures and click on the albums, you'll see some of my spring training albums. And there's pictures with me catching Eckersley. And one of my favorite things was at Salt River Field the first year we opened there with the Rockies. They hadn't got the signage up around the ballpark yet. So teams that were coming in to play us couldn't figure out where to go. And I happened to be leaving one of the bullpens with my little Cushman, with my stuff on the back, and I see the Oakland A's van pulling in and going the wrong direction. And I'm like, I know that's their coaches, and they're going to the D-back side. So I did a U-turn. I followed them, and I said, guys, you parked in the wrong spot. Don't worry. Just everybody jump on my cart, and I'll take you to the field, and then I'll bring you back. Well, the first guy that jumps in next to me is Ricky Henderson.
Wow.
And I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever.
Because Ricky doesn't wait for anyone.
He was so cool.
Oh, yeah, the best.
He signed a bunch of stuff for me.
That's great.
Yeah, he was cool. But it was one of the funnest jobs of all time.
Doug, before we go, and I pass it off to you, Mike, you got to share the story of being a replacement player. Looks like the season's about to start. You're a home game against Cleveland in Cleveland. This, my friends, from Doug Rupple, is one of the greatest stories you will ever hear.
It is funny because,
podcast.
Yeah, so this was our as a Mets replacement player, we had that one exhibition game before the home opener, and you always played it in a major league park somewhere. We just happened that year to play in Cleveland at Jacobs Field, and of course my parents were still alive and living down the street in Canton, so my whole family came up, and there was a good crowd at the stadium. I had a couple good hits in the game, but in about the third inning or fourth inning, I hit a double off the left field wall, missed a home run by a few inches. And I'm standing on second base and the stadium goes insane. And I'm thinking, well, that's really nice. The Cleveland crowd must know I'm from Canton, Ohio, and they're giving me this hometown. And I'm gonna tip my cap and say thank you when the Cleveland Indians second baseman says, "Hey, dummy, they're not clapping for you." And I'm like, "What?" And he goes, "Look at the scoreboard." And I turned around and looked at the jumbo scoreboard, and it said, "The Major League Baseball strike has just ended."
Now, there's so many layers to that story.
Yes.
You know, first, the person who decided that was the appropriate time to put it on the scoreboard, they just couldn't contain the excitement. It was just in that moment, and they had to hit that button at that
And
time.
you know what? I literally think, as I remember out of my back of my head, as I hit the ball, I saw something come up on the scoreboard. I didn't know what it was as I was running out of the box, but I remember seeing something, and I think it came up right as I made contact with the ball. But of course, I didn't look until, but it was just funny. But the funny thing was, before we took the field that day, there was a good indication that strike was going to end anyway, because if we all made it to opening day, they had to pay every one of us $100,000.
Wow.
Well, I knew they didn't want to do that.
No.
And so they told us when we took the field, play this like it's the last game of your life. And for most of us, it was, as far as that goes. There was only a couple guys that came out of that and played big league ball. Kareem Garcia was one of them. And I think there was a couple more, but they had a hard way to go, because I really didn't want to become a big leaguer as a scab. I grew up in a union household, and it kind of bothered me a little bit, but I thought, how do you pass up being a Major League Baseball player?
Absolutely.
Understood. And it worked out beautifully for you, a long career as a bullpen catcher and everything else in baseball. And you kept, you were not a scab because you weren't.
Yeah. Luckily, the game really didn't count.
That's correct. Correct. But here's my additional question, Mike. You prompt me to ask that question. So the game ends. What did they say to you guys? In the clubhouse, knock, knock, who's there? Not you, go home. What did they say?
Well, they basically told us before the game that this could happen. And they said, if it does, just ignore this thing. Just play the game out. We're going to finish the 9 innings. And then you'll come in, you'll clean your lockers up, and I'll say thank you to all of you. And that's pretty much what they did. We cleaned our lockers out, and most everybody had plane tickets. I just went down to my parents' house in Canton down the road.
Right,
So
that was a home game for you. It was literally
I didn't have far to go. So I went home, and and everybody was trying to console me. And I'm like, are you kidding me? This was one of the greatest days of my life and one of the greatest months. Doing the spring training down at Port St. Lucie and the whole deal. It was fun. And I said, I enjoyed it for what it was. Yep. I knew it wasn't going to last. So my whole thing was, I just want to fill their shoes long enough for them to get their act back together. And let's not embarrass the game too much until they come back. And that was my whole thing. Let's just not embarrass the game.
And some of us are old enough to remember that whole situation. And I have to tell you, you guys really did a good job. You did not embarrass yourselves. You guys played hard. And you, of course, had talent. I'm sure there were guys who tried out that probably didn't have much talent. Let's be honest.
There were a few, but not too many. If you got to that point, somebody got you there. Because, a matter of fact, with the Mets, you had to play some minor league ball to even be invited.
Good.
So, yeah. So if I wouldn't have even had that little cup of coffee with the Indians, I probably might not have made it. But the thing was, the even goofier backstory is how it happened was, again, I was working with the Indians, and I even in my tryout with the Mets, I'm in an Indians uniform, but I'm getting ready to go to Key West, and then I'm going to come back and work for the Indians. Mm-hmm. And again, Jeff Torborg said to me, the Mets are looking for a catcher. And I said, Jeff, I don't want to drive all the way to Port St. Lucie just to catch a couple guys and then them send me home. And he goes, what if I guarantee you a spot? I said, well, if you can get that done, you let me know. I'm going to be in Key West for a couple of days. But because my birthday I got signed on my birthday. But it was funny because I go to Key West, and this is in the early days of the old cell phones.
Sure.
And I literally got to Key West, checked into my room, and that cell phone went off, and it was Steve Phillips.
Wow.
And he's like, I heard I have to give you a spot if you come. And I said, well, if I drive from Key West to Port St. Lucie, yes, you better give me a spot. And so they did. But it was fun. It was a lot of fun. And I don't regret it, because I would have regretted it if I didn't take the opportunity. And especially now, I've had 12 knee surgeries. I've had a knee replacement. I've had 4 wrist surgeries, 2 elbow surgeries. If I was a horse, they'd shoot me.
Well, hopefully they'd miss, because I'm enjoying it. We want to have you back. This is great.
This is great. Yeah. And I guess we can make our kind of final transition here. So one thing that's speaking with you is very encouraging, because it could be easy for those that don't know the minor league ballparks, the life of a minor league ball player can
very
be
hard.
It's like, hey, honey, how you doing? I'm good. I'm going to Mexico today. And okay, 3 days later, yeah, now I'm going to, Tucson. And so you just never know, where you're going to go from day to day. And so it can be easy to just kind of throw in the towel and just say, I can't do this, especially when you're looking at the salaries and things like that. And so it's very encouraging. You kind of stuck with it, kept with it there, and you just made the best of every opportunity. And you chose not to when you were given, hey, this is the end of the road here. It's easy to just put that head down in the sand and just call it over. But you saw, hey, like you said, no, this was a tremendous opportunity. I'm going to, relish every moment of it. And so that's just very encouraging.
Well, thanks. For me, anything I could have done. I mean, I would have cleaned toilets in the clubhouse if that was the only job they had. I didn't care. I've done everything. I've worked in the clubhouses I've worked in clubhouses. I've done official scoring. I did that with the Shorebirds in the South Atlantic League. I did play-by-play. I did PA announcing. I've done a bullpen catching. So if there's the only thing I haven't done was tear tickets or been an usher or make a hot dogs. But I'd do that if they'd let me. I don't care. As long as I'm at the ballpark, I'm okay. But and my next door, like I said, when I was a kid, my next door neighbor lived down the street with Thurman Munson, and he's pretty much the guy that taught me to catch. And one of the things that was cool was Diana, his wife, said to me one day, she goes, Thurman would be pretty proud to know that you caught for 19 years as a bullpen catcher. It was spring trainings, but he goes, that he would have been so proud to know that you were able to do that. And that makes me happy to know that, because I used to have so many conversations with Thurman, and he just was such an influential guy.
Oh, the best. You're bringing tears to my eyes now. Seriously. I mean, I loved watching him play, and the leader he was.
I was at his funeral, and I'll tell you right now, to this day, it was one of the saddest days I've ever remember. And I'm really good friends with his son, Mike, who at that time was only about 5. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget the tears. This was at the Canton Civic Center. They had to put it in the biggest place they could put it in, because almost every major league player in the country came to the funeral. And but it was crazy. As Diana, Thurman's widow, and Mike and the 2 sisters come down the aisle to the funeral, they had a casket up there with a wreath with the Yankee NY on one side, and another flower display with 15 on the other side.
Mhm.
And sure enough, here comes Diana with the 3 kids and little Michael at 5 years old, dressed in a little Yankee uniform with number 15 on his back. And the minute everybody saw him, the tears and just the crying. And I'll still never forget Reggie Jackson was one of the most broke up people at that funeral. For everybody that wants to think that they hated each other, that was not the case in any way. They had a mutual respect.
Yep.
You know, Thurman didn't like some of the stuff that Reggie did and said, but he respected for what that guy brought to the table.
Oh, listen, he's a winner, and you need to watch. Anybody who hasn't watched the Reggie Jackson documentary that came out recently, to get into it. Thurman and him had a healthy, wonderful relationship, and when they knocked heads like professionals. They talked it out. You know that. I love that you brought that up, because they did. I mean,
well, one of the things I always laugh about, and so did Diana, in 2000, I think it was 7 or 8, Diana and Mike, her son, opened a bar in Canton, Ohio called Munson's Home Plate Grill. And they asked me if I would come DJ the grand opening. And I said, yes, because I could come do that on my way to go to spring training with the Rockies. And I'd come by, see my folks. So as a kid, you got to remember, I lived a few houses away, but Thurman would go golfing a lot on his day off, and he usually had a couple players with him. It was usually Lou Piniella and Bobby Mercer.
Bob Mercer, yeah. And
sometimes it was not Willie Randolph, but Mickey Rivers. There was a few other guys that would come on occasion. But they would get out of the car, and they'd been drinking most of the day, and they'd get to Thurman's house, and they'd see me up on my hill in my little tractor, mowing my yard, wearing my headset, AM, FM radio, listening to the Indians games. And Thurman would say, look at that little fool up there. He's listening to the Indians. So they would grab apples and throw them at me. And they'd hit me with apples. Thurman and Bobby and Lou. And they'd pelt me with apples. So I'm sitting there coming in to do this party in 2008 at Munson's Grill, and I walk in, and Diana gives me a big hug and is hugging me. And as she's hugging me, Lou Piniella and Bobby Mercer walk in. And they kind of push me out of the way to get to Diana. And she says, by the way, you know that guy you just pushed out of the way there? And Lou goes, God, he looks kind of familiar. And I knew Lou from working in the Cleveland with Cleveland when the Mariners would come in. I never mentioned this story to him because I just didn't want to embarrass him.
Right.
So Diana says, you know who that is, don't you? And he said, no. He said, well, you ought to. You used to hit it with apples. And both of their mouths at the same time dropped. And they both came over and hugged me at the same time. I go, that was you? I'm so sorry. We used to beat the hell out of you with apples. And I said, oh, let me tell you, I went to school a couple of times and had welts on me. And my parents got called because they thought that my parents were abusing me. And I said, and I had to explain to them, no, it was Lou Piniella, Bobby Mercer, and Thurman Munson.
Throwing apples at me. I got nothing more to say. That's the greatest story I've ever. That might be the greatest, sports story I've heard. And I've been blessed to talk to quite a few sports figures.
They were good
and
guys.
People in sports. That is a very funny. Did not expect that story.
I used to cook at a restaurant around the corner from our house called the Four Winds, and it used to handle all the Pro Football Hall of Fame luncheons. So every Monday there's a luncheon with celebrities and would be there. Thurman would always come in during the off season. He'd sit at this bar that kind of overlooked the banquet room, but he never would go down into the banquet. And I kept saying to him all the time, I'd get done cooking because I cooked there. I'd come out and sit and have lunch with Thurman. I'd say, Thurman, how come you never go down there? He said, I don't want to be down there with all those brown nosers. He said, I don't need a bunch of people kissing me and telling me they love me. He says, I'll stay back here. And he did. That was just the way he was.
That's Thurman.
Well, if you didn't know him, people thought he was kind of a jerk, but he wasn't. He just had a tight group of friends that he trusted, and that was kind of where his limits laid. If you weren't in that group, you had a hard time getting in, because he just, he knew everybody wanted something from him.
Right.
And I knew him forever and never asked him for anything. And he loved that.
Right. He knew you were a guy. He knew
he knew the only thing I wanted. He
Yeah.
knew the only thing I wanted from him was baseball knowledge. I wanted to soak up everything I could learn about catching. And it was funny because when I met Jeff Torborg, my first year I met him, and he watched me catch, I was probably like 17 when I first met Jeff Torborg at a tryout. And Torborg pulled me aside. He goes, "Where did you learn to catch like that?" And I said, "Well, my neighbor, Thurman Munson." And his mouth dropped. He goes, "You know Thurman?" And I go, "That's my neighbor." And I think Jeff just kind of kept an eye on me the rest of whenever he'd hear my name, he'd kind of look up after that point. And because I came across Jeff multiple times throughout my time in baseball, and he was the most gracious man I've ever met. Just such a nice person.
That's excellent. And take it from a guy myself who I did private security for years with our dad and some other things. And you meet some of these people that are more famous than others, let's put it that way.
Right.
And they always had that thing. There is a group of people that person's okay. I don't have to worry what this person wants from me. This person's not good. You were one of those people at Thurman. That's unbelievable. That's great. You know?
He was awesome. You know what? It's funny because I think whenever I go back and I see Mike, his son owns a bar in Canton too now called Tugboats, which was Thurman's nickname. So if anybody's ever in the Canton, Ohio area, you can do a lot of things. You can see the Pro Football Hall of Fame. You can go to Tugboats and see Mike Munson. And Thurman's grave is just around the corner from there. And it's a beautiful, beautiful grave that has an etching of Thurman on it, and it says the Yankee captain on it. Beautiful. And if you're a baseball fan, it gives you chills. But and then of course you're only an hour from Cleveland to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So it's in that area. There's a lot to do.
And don't throw apples at Doug. No throwing apples at Doug. We don't.
Well, here's the thing. I don't move like I used to.
Yeah, right.
Oh, that's tremendous.
Yeah, I got these matching zippers on my knees now, so.
That's unbelievable.
Yes.
Yeah, no dancing with the stars for me.
No.
No. So no, I enjoyed this immensely, and thank you so much, Doug. And hopefully stars align down the line. We can do this again.
Anytime.
Really enjoyed it, and looking forward to that. And Darren, any last words on your end, or?
Just Doug, if somebody wants to get in touch with you or follow you, you mentioned Facebook and social media or anything like that. How could they get in touch with you? How could they follow you?
Well, I have a website, which is djrupe.com, or they go to Facebook, which is Doug Rupple, DOUGRUPPLE at Facebook. And those are probably the two best ways to get up with me. But and if you go to my Facebook page, click on the pictures, you'll if you're a baseball fan, there's a lot of good spring training pictures on there and some good photos. There's, speaking of the Rockies, some of my favorite guys back in the day were Todd Helton, Troy Tulowitzki, Dexter Fowler, Jason Giambi. Oh my gosh, had so much fun with those guys.
That's when I got to ask, what was your initial reaction? Got the news recently, Todd Helton, Hall of Fame.
So happy for him. He deserves it. He deserves it. He truly deserves it. I think this whole thing about the Coors Field effect is overrated. Because you still got to play 81 games on the road.
100%.
And Todd Helton had just as good a numbers on the road as he did at home. So, and the guy was one hell of a player. And really, what I loved about him was he was a selfless teammate. I used to watch this guy work with players, just young kids, the younger minor leaguers that, I don't know if these kids probably going to make it out of spring training or not, but he'd spend some time and help them and watch them swing. And Todd and Jason Giambi were two of the nicest and most Well, to me, they were kind of like the Jim Tomeys. When I worked with Cleveland, Jim Tomey was that guy who would just go out of his way to help you in any way possible. I think Jim Tomey and Jason Jamie are very much alike. They would talk to a telephone pole if it was there by itself. They're so nice.
I love hearing these stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Well,
Mike,
I tell you, and you know what? That's the cool thing about spring training that I got to do is, you get to eat breakfast and lunch and a lot of times dinner with these guys. So it was just you're living with them for 2 months. Well, at least because I always had to be down there when pitchers. Well, we'd go down before the week before because fantasy camp. Then we'd have a week off, and then spring training would start with which was optionals. And a lot of guys would come in for optionals. And then, of course, when mandatories would hit, it was full blown. But literally, I would be down there from the end of January till April. So you're eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner with these guys. And
that's got to be incredible.
It's funny. Nolan Arenado and Charlie Blackmon were rookies at the time, not even in the major leagues. And I had a high top conversion van that I used to drive from Maryland to Arizona for spring training. And they asked, they would pay me to be their designated driver. And I would drive them around at night to go to, some of the bars,
right?
Which was very smart on their part instead of drinking and driving. And you got a big van. How about taking us to a couple bars? And each guy would throw $100 at me, and I'd make $500-600 in a night just driving these guys around for a few hours, and had a ball. And I'd look at my back of my van. It's Charlie Blackmon and Nolan Arenado, and these guys. And I'm like, yeah, this isn't too bad.
Yeah, I
can't complain there. Gotta love that. Well, thank you so much, Doug. Again, really appreciate you taking the time. This was fantastic. Darren, once again, and so just thank you for being part of our Around the Ballpark podcast. And join us next our next episode. We're going to talk some Chicago Cubs baseball. And until then, we will see you around the ballpark.